introduce yourself and your colleagues in anything, of course, way of a short statement. The Secretary of State.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm delighted to be making my 7th appearance before the committee in my role as Secretary of State for Scotland. I think, Mr. Chairman, I'll break with tradition and not call for the First Minister to appear in front of your committee. I do note that the last request you made to her, she had a diary clash and couldn't attend, and instead appeared on Loose Women. When asked by journalists later why she did that rather than the Scottish Affairs Committee, she said she wasn't answerable to this Parliament, so that's one to note for the future. But what I would say is I'm joined today by my ministerial colleagues, John Lamont, Lord Orford of Garville, and by Lynn MacDonald, who is the Director of the Scotland Office covering for Lawrence Rocky, who's currently on paternity leave. Mr. Chairman, quite a lot has happened since I last gave evidence to the committee in November last year, and there are a number of issues I felt it would be helpful to mention at the start of the session. You've kindly given me a few words, and it really isn't a very long opening statement. But I just want to say I'm delighted to say the UK and the Scottish governments are collaborating and working effectively together in a number of areas. In January, we jointly announced the creation of 2 free ports centred on the Firth of Forth and on the Cromarty Firth. They're making good progress towards completing their business cases, and after visiting the Cromarty Freeport with the Prime Minister in January, it was a pleasure to be back there last week for myself to see progress firsthand. Our joint city and region growth deal programme continues to create jobs, deliver new economic opportunities across Scotland, and of the hundreds of projects taking shape, I'd just like to highlight one following the coronation of His Majesty the King, and that is the new Perth Museum, which has £10 million of UK government investment, Mr. Chairman. I know you'll be very pleased about that. And this museum is going to provide a permanent home for the stone of Scone, for the coronation stone that was obviously so prominent during the recent coronation of Westminster Abbey. And what we plan with this museum is to bring this sort of amazing centuries-old story to life using cutting-edge technology in a purpose-built exhibition space that will be just a few miles away from its ancient home of Scone Palace, where Scottish kings were once crowned upon it. The UK government's also now working with the Scottish Government on transport projects, and I'm delighted to say that the Scottish Government, and this is one for me, Mr. Chairman, now, have agreed with us to work on a feasibility study for upgrading the A75, following Lord Hendy's review of vital UK transport links, and I look forward to that partnership developing. Of course, inevitably there are areas of disagreement that have emerged between the two governments, and I'm disappointed that the Scottish Government have chosen to challenge my decision to use Section 35 of the Scotland Act in relation to their gender recognition bill. But I would say the UK Government will defend that very, very robustly in court. Also, I hope the Scottish Government will work with the UK Government as they seek to address the problems with their deposit return scheme. The UK Government wants to work with the Scottish Government to realise our shared ambition of improving the environment while meeting the needs of consumers and businesses across the United Kingdom. Finally, I would note the Scottish Government's criticism of the new FCDO guidelines on supporting the devolved administrations on overseas visits. And in my view, that criticism is misplaced. The new guidelines do not, as claimed, hinder the Scottish Government's ability to engage overseas. Rather, they confirm the ongoing support provided by the FCDO for legitimate work in devolved policy areas. I know this committee is inquiring separately into how Scotland is promoted abroad, and my department's submission, compiled jointly with colleagues across Whitehall, sets out the huge effort being made by the UK Government in this area. However, despite inevitable disagreements, as I said at the beginning, my assessment of how the UK and Scottish governments are working together is a very positive one. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would say that we're collaborating on an increasing range of projects that will make real differences to people's lives, and that is exactly what the people of Scotland want and expect from their two governments. Thank you.
And thank you, Secretary of State, for a very concise introduction, for introducing your team. And welcome, Ms MacDonald, your first time at the committee, and 7 times Secretary of State. And I think we've got you for a further one in the next few weeks. And we're obviously keen to get the most out of you before we lose you to the House of Lords. So we'll try to come to your door more often.
I think we've cleared that matter up last week in the press. I'm not going anywhere.
Oh, you're not? Okay, well, that's a relief to this committee, but thank you. And thank you once again for referencing Perth Museum, and I think we're all sort of celebrating in the bountiness of the UK government when it comes to projects in our constituencies. You mentioned a lot of things, that the working arrangements between the Scottish and UK government. This is just my observation, and I'll see what you think of this. I don't think that intergovernment relations have ever been at such a low ebb between UK and Scottish governments, and they seem to be characterised by mistrust, by never-ending conflict, and a sense of diktat. Now, I know you'll possibly disagree with that, but I think you yourself must sense that we're not in a particularly good place with all this, and I know that you'll be tempted to lay the blame at Scottish Government for a lot of that, which would be quite fair of you to do so. But what are you doing personally, and what is your office doing to try and improve the atmosphere and the culture of operation and working between the two governments?
Well, I think what I've tried to bring to the job is honesty and a clear position from the UK government, so that the Scottish government know where we are on positions, not to fudge any issues. It's not the way I do things. And over the interministerial group programme, which we spoke about when I was last here in November. I mean, since that, we now have 15 interministerial groups up and running. There have been regular meetings developing in most policy areas, not entirely all policy areas, but most policy areas are being covered, and I think that's obviously a positive. I myself attended again this morning a DEFRA interministerial group meeting with the Scottish Government, with ministers from Wales and Scotland, and obviously representatives from the civil service in Northern Ireland. So I feel that we are working well together behind the scenes. We're delivering on free ports. We're getting on with city and region growth deals. We're talking to the Scottish Government about 2 investment zones in Scotland. We are obviously, as I've said to you in the past, the Scottish Government get up each day and go to work to destroy the United Kingdom, and I get up and go to work each day to strengthen the United Kingdom, and we know that's our position. And actually, in conversations I've had with First Ministers and others in the past, we acknowledge that we are absolutely polar opposites. We at the beginning of the discussions, we say we completely disagree on that matter, but let's see what we can agree on, and then we get on with the job in hand. But we absolutely, and that's what the press maybe give maybe when they write, there is obviously the disagreement around the independence issue and around Brexit and around UKIM, and I understand all that, but my job is to strengthen the Constitution and defend devolution, and I think the Scottish governments want to break up the United Kingdom, which would bring devolution to an end. I think that's, I don't know if you want to, I know you've done a lot of meetings, Minister Lammett's had a lot of meetings. Before
Minister Lamett, which I'm very keen to hear his perspective on this, I just wonder how helpful you think, destroy the UK, that type of
I think it's honest. I said at the beginning I'm honest. It's an honest position. They want to destroy the United Kingdom.
There's being honest, then there's using language, which is not in the least bit constructive.
No, helpful. But it's honest.
I think it's just making that sort of distinction.
Do you want
I asked you directly exactly what you were doing to try and improve the situation, and all I heard was a sort of a comment that was actually going to make the situation worse. What are you doing directly to try and improve the situation and the culture of working between Scottish and UK government?
I think if we come at this honestly and we acknowledge that they want to destroy the United Kingdom, they want to bring it to an end, they want to break it, whatever language you want to use, and they know that I want to strengthen it by having more UK government investment into local authorities, real devolution as I call it. If we're open with each other, that's my strategy, that's their strategy, we then find the bit in the middle where we can meet and work together, and we find lots of areas we can do that. As I listed in my previous answer, free ports, investment zones, city and region growth deals, there's more things coming down the track. Union Connectivity Review. We're beginning to work on those things because they are good for the people of Scotland, because they bring jobs to Scotland, they bring high-skilled, high-paid jobs, and that's what I'm focused on, is improving the economy. But I'm not going to pretend that I'm giving any ground on on powers that would allow a referendum to take place, for instance, a Section 30. I'm not going to pretend for a minute that I'm going to do that, because I'm not. So it's easier to be clear about that and then get on with the business end of things.
I'm not sensing much of anything that's coming from you about how you're trying to improve the situation. We'll leave that just now, because I know you're keen to bring in Minister Lamont. I don't know if Mr Lamont's going to refer to the Joint Ministerial Working Groups. Is that?
I can do, Chairman, if
before
like.
that, maybe you could, as a question to you then, like I know back in 2022 there was 22 of these groups were supposed to be set up, and I think the Secretary of State said there's now 15 in operation. Why is it taking such a long time to get these groups up and running, particularly when there does seem to be a number of difficulties and issues in working arrangements between Scottish and UK government? Why is it taking such a long time?
Well, Chairman, I can confirm that 15 inter-ministerial groups have been established. I think Wendy Chamberlain raised the workings of these groups at the last committee session that I appeared at. I think it's testament to this government, this United Kingdom government's commitment to the jointly shared structures between this government and other parts of the United Kingdom. It's a whole government approach as well, in that all parts of government recognise the importance of intergovernmental working. Now, in terms of how often these groups meet, I mean, obviously it depends on departments, it depends on ministers, it depends on the topicality of the issues being discussed. I can also confirm, just in relation to, I think you said there should be 22, and as I said, there are 15, but I can confirm that in relation to health and transport, they're now also operational, and the first meeting of the Inter-Ministerial Group on Justice will be taking place shortly.
Yes, that the UK Government's Intergovernment Relations Annual Report 2022 recorded was a total of 277 intergovernmental ministerial meetings in 2022, down from 446 in 2021. That's not exactly progress, is it?
Well, as I say, the frequency of these meetings will depend on the issues that are being discussed and the departments that are affected. But it's also important to recognise that that's not the only forum where, by which ministers are engaging. Certainly the interministerial groups are very much at the heart of it, but I certainly know from my personal experience there's many informal discussions I have with my counterparts in the Scottish Government, which very often produces the same outcomes as the IMGs.
Getting back to you, Secretary of State, I asked you last week at Scottish Questions about our ongoing work in promoting Scotland internationally, and you gave us a positive response about, both governments working well together. And I think what we found as a committee in our visits, and I know Minister Lamont was in New York at the same time as us, is this has seemed to be pretty constructive and worked quite well together. And I think it was characterised to us as that what the Scottish Government does is give added value and helps promote Scotland internationally. So it wasn't a rather clumsy letter from the Foreign Secretary when he got in touch with the Cabinet Secretary in Scotland, laying down new guidelines, which almost seemed like it's unnecessary and seemed to be provocative. Surely that wasn't helpful at all in getting this joint working, because we're trying to be constructive today about seeing what we could do about working together, not using language which is inflammatory, making sure we set the parameters for good working arrangements, but that didn't seem to go down particularly well at all in terms of joint working, did it?
Well, it didn't go down very well with old Air Miles Angus for a very good reason, and that's because he took offence at us calling him out for visiting governments and talking to them about leaving, in matters we know are reserved, the Constitution and foreign affairs, talking about our relationship towards Brexit, our relationship with other countries, about the Scottish Government leaving the United Kingdom, talking about straying into territories of the Constitution and foreign affairs. And we don't think that our high commissions, our embassies, our consulates should be used for that purpose. We believe the United Kingdom infrastructure, those missions, should be used for the Scottish Government to promote trade and other things, and culture and other things, as we've agreed. All the devolved areas we have no problem, but once you go into the reserved areas and start talking about those, then we take exception to it. And I completely agree with the letter that the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, FCDO, sent the Foreign Secretary.
I was just going to quote something to you from Henry McLeish, who was the minister that got this 1998 Scotland Act through, and obviously is very much aware of some of the inclusions and all that. What he said, he described that letter as political control and coercion, and asked that the Foreign Secretary should withdraw? He's got a point, isn't he? I mean, this is somebody who helped design the whole of the Scotland Act framework and is very much aware of what the responsibilities governments have. And he's asking for that. Surely that's quite serious.
So I saw that, those comments by Henry McLeish. I think he got himself into a muddle, to be quite frank. It's very clear what the... And the Foreign Secretary made it very clear in his letter. We want to work with the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations to promote areas that are devolved, but not to facilitate straying into areas that are reserved. As I say, the Constitution,
the one example
Brexit,
I think we heard was
undermining our... Just to be clear, sorry, Mr. Chair, I should be clear. When these meetings are taking place and we have representatives from the Foreign Office in the meetings, and discussions are taking place to undermine the UK's position on Brexit and other parts of foreign affairs, or to discuss the breakup of the United Kingdom, that's where we take exception. As simple as that. Everything else, we want to facilitate it and we want to work together.
Could you perhaps, and I know Lord Offord wants to come in this, but could you perhaps give us a detail about all these conversations and where any unhappiness has been raised? Could you do that?
All I would say...
If you could write to the committee on that basis.
What I would say is that you should speak to the Foreign Office on this, but I won't today discuss the detail of what I've seen, but I have seen many examples, and there was a sort of an indication given in November that needed to stop, and it was ignored, and it actually got worse, and there were 5 or 6 other examples brought to light to the Secretary of State.
Would you be able to write to the committee
and
with
myself,
those examples?
But I'm just going to say of transgressions of what we thought was the right position, and that's when the letter went. And I feel it was the right letter. It was. I saw the letter. I absolutely approved of the content of that letter, and despite what Henry McLeish may say, because I think it's wrong for us to facilitate using our embassies and high commissions, members of devolved administrations, to then go meet foreign government ministers and undermine our foreign policy, which is what they were doing. And that had to stop. And that's all we're asking to stop, nothing else.
It's just so disappointing.
Entirely reasonable.
Yeah, thank you. Just so disappointing because of the tone and tenor of what we found in this committee, that things are working well together, and all that did was...
It doesn't work well together when a minister turns up from a devolved administration and undermines the position of the UK government. And actually, if you speak to consuls and ambassadors from countries like France and Spain and say to them, how would you feel? How would you feel if we facilitated the UK government? Facilitated meetings for the Catalans in Westminster, or your embassy did that, or your embassy, the French embassy, facilitated for where there's 60% for separation in Corsica for the Corsicans to come and meet UK government ministers. I don't think President Macron would take a very... I think he might take a dim view.
Okay, well, you're going to write to the committee with these examples.
I haven't said I am.
Well, if you could please write to the committee.
Well, I'll see what of the communiques that I have, because there is a piece where it cuts into the Foreign Office's rules, but I will discuss with the Foreign Office's rules what I can share with you.
Thank you. And just lastly for me, we've obviously all seen the remarks from Lord Frost about the reversing of devolution. Could you just assure this committee that is not this government's intention at all? He talks about having some sort of support within the Conservative Party for his views. Again, I think we'd just like to be assured that this is not the current thinking.
So I can assure you that not only have we not reversed devolution in any shape or form, since Brexit, more powers have gone to the Scottish Parliament. We have in no way undermined devolution, and that is not the plan.
We could take that as a categoric assurance. Then.
A categoric assurance that is not the direction of travel. Quite the contrary. We are the people who want to strengthen devolution, which is why we have more engagement with local authorities, why we want people in Scotland to know they have 2 governments and the 2 governments are working for them.
Okay, DG Brock.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just continuing on the line of questioning about that Foreign Affairs diktat, or the FCDO's diktat, I just wondered, it's a question I think I put to the Foreign Secretary a couple of weeks ago. It was just exactly how will those diplomats intervene if ministers from other governments start going off-piste in terms of the topics they're supposed to be discussing? What are they going to be doing in those meetings to stop that from happening?
Well, that, again, you'll have to ask the Foreign Secretary what his plans are for that. He's been very clear that
But presumably this was discussed
our missions
with
and our
you.
posts are not to be used for undermining the UK government's reserve policies. It's as simple as that. As to what happens next, that's a matter for the Foreign Secretary. But to date, since the diktat went out, we've actually seen a change of approach and attitude, and we are back onto where we were maybe a year ago, when things were going fine. It's only of late things have gone off the rails. We're now back on a steady progress. Steady
I mean, you go often on overseas trips yourself and communicate with or meet with ministers from other governments. Can you describe to me the circumstances under which you can imagine diplomats intervening on your conversation and saying that what you are discussing is not appropriate? How does that work?
I think you're getting confused, if I may say, about the difference between the position of the UK government as opposed to devolved administrations and what is, we saw this with the Supreme Court judgment in November last year. What is reserved and what is...
I appreciate reserved versus devolved areas. What I'm talking about is those diplomats saying to ministers from other governments, from other countries or other areas that you cannot discuss this.
Well, as I said,
ministers.
We would not be having meetings with the Catalans or the Corsicans separatists. I mean, it's.
Are you equating the country of Scotland
it's because
to those areas?
Well, I'm saying that the Scottish government want to break up the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom government wants to. As I say, the reason devolution works is because if everyone's there is a Scotland Act, and if we all adhere to the Scotland Act and the principles behind it, then devolution works perfectly well. But if we go, it's no different to the Scottish government put in their manifesto the removal of Trident from Faslane. But that's a reserved matter. So I wouldn't expect the Scottish government to go off and talk to foreign countries about removing Trident from Faslane because it's entirely in the reserved area.
Okay.
It's just common sense. The MOD, the Secretary of State for Defence, speaks on behalf of Trident, no one else. That's how the system works.
Okay. All right. We'll leave that there for the moment. I'm still not hearing any sort of practical examples of how that might work.
And I'm saying you'll get them from the Foreign Secretary as and when the moment comes.
I thought you might have discussed it with him in some detail. But
I might have done, but I'm not sharing it with you.
Can I just say I'm really delighted... Is that right?
Indeed, that is right.
Delighted that you brought up the city and regional growth deals, Secretary of State, and your defence of devolution, because I came across an article by an academic, Janice Morfitt, who writes on policy, public sector and planning issues. It's published online in the Local Economy Journal. It was published online on April the 27th of this year, and it's entitled Deals and Devolution, the Role of Local Authority Deals in Undermining Devolved Decision-Making. And she talks about what she sees as a Westminster agenda to re-centralise powers back to London from devolved nations. She raises a number of concerns about the city and regional deals in Scotland. And amongst those are the projects in those deal programmes were assessed using criteria set by the Whitehall government. Whitehall had the final say on agreeing those projects, even though they're in devolved areas, and the UK government only makes a part funding, a direct funding, a contribution. And she says the deals provide a double bonus to a Westminster re-centralising agenda, as Scottish Government provides 50% funding and so reduces its capacity to spend those funds on projects to deliver their own priorities. Can I ask what your thoughts are in relation to those concerns I've just expressed?
Well, I don't recognise that at all to be the case. We share those, and I don't think the Scottish Government would either, on the city and region growth deals. There are some things fully funded by the Scottish Government. There's some things fully funded by the UK Government. A good example would be the one I referred to earlier, the new museum in Perth, fully funded by the UK Government. And then there are other projects that we fund with local authorities of the Scottish Government. We share it, and some things we fund only with the Scottish Government. And there are some things in the separate structural funding directly with local authorities. It's a huge mix of things, but and depending on who's the lead funder, if you like, they probably have more, well, undoubtedly have more say in the business case and getting it, because they're responsible for it. It's their accounting manager who has to take responsibility. That's how this works. So I think what's written there doesn't reflect the reality.
Okay, but I mean the point that she makes about the Scottish Government having to provide 50% funding, because that is, I mean, in fact, I think we provided more than 50% funding. The Scottish Government providing that, and then not having the capacity as a result to spend those funds on projects to deliver their own priorities. Isn't that a point worth making?
I wouldn't accept that, would you?
Mr. Lamb?
No, I don't accept that point.
Certainly, I mean, my experience of the growth deals in my own area with the Borderlands growth deal is both governments working together on the projects that they want to deliver for the south of Scotland, and it's worked very, very well, both in terms of identifying the projects that were to be funded, the allocation of funding between those projects, and then the delivery of those projects with the cooperation and working with the local authorities. I think one of the keys for the success of these growth deals has been the involvement with local communities and the local authorities in terms of developing plans and proposals with the Scottish Government and the UK Government actually delivering them.
But these are examples of the UK Government stepping into devolved areas, aren't they?
It's working in partnership with both governments working together to deliver projects for the betterment of the communities that we all represent.
All right, lovely.
And I'm sorry that
you spoke of being answerable to Parliament, Secretary of State, and I presume in that it's a very important thing. But she also points out that issues of accountability in that reports of both Audit Scotland and the National Audit Office indicate that neither has the power to scrutinise the deal agreement specifically in relation to the UK government's actions. I think she describes it as operating within a devolution loophole. The accountability for these deals appears to fall between the audit services for the devolved authorities or administrations and the National Audit Office. Is that something you'd recognise?
Lord, I can't hear what you're saying, sadly. I've got terrible tinnitus, but Lord Opera's going to answer.
I can come in on this because, I've been in post now 18 months, and a large part of what I've been doing is the levelling up agenda, city regional deals, the result of which is that the UK Government, through the Scotland Office, is now in direct contact with 32 local authorities. We speak to them a lot, and they say to me that they are delighted with the engagement with the UK Government, never had such positive engagement with the UK Government, and that the fact that we're not prescriptive with them on their project, they bring their projects up. It's real devolution because it's real people in their communities coming out with their projects, not being dictated to. And the other observation they make is that obviously in terms of their relationship with the Scottish Government, their budgets have been cut and indeed have been ring-fenced. And so the message that I get a lot is that their flexibility is increasingly diminished. But that the engagement with the UK government gives them additional firepower.
My question related
and that's from SNP-led councils as well.
My question related to accountability and whether it does in fact operate within a devolution loophole in that the National Audit Office nor Audit Scotland is able to properly scrutinise UK government actions within Scottish devolved areas. Is that, well, you don't. There's lots of puzzle faces looking at me. Perhaps you can write to me on that.
I think you're conflating two things. I'm afraid. No. So, the city and region. I'm afraid it is. You are conflating two things, and that's why we're all looking slightly puzzled at what you're saying. I mean, that partly because I can't hear everything you're saying, but where we have structural funding. And that is audited through the Treasury and the various audit functions that we have for the UK Gov, which is the structural funding side, which was previously audited by the EU, but we're in the place of the EU in that. And then we have the city and region growth deals, and that is audited in Scotland. And that's how and the city and region growth deals, the actual growth deals sit with the delivery, the lead delivery partner, even on the pieces we do, we still channel, whether it's the garden in Clackmannanshire that was brought back or whatever else, we're still channeling that money through Scotland, the Scottish Government, and into the local authority and into with the city and region growth deals. That money still flows in that direction. So I'm not sure quite I think you're looking for a grievance on something that doesn't exist, on something that's actually delivering very good news for...
just looking at an article written by an academic who was making those points.
I think it's important to say that I've certainly not seen the article. I'm not sure if the rest of us on this side of the table have seen the article. But my understanding is both governments, both the UK government and the Scottish government, support the growth deals and are working with local authorities.
That's not what I'm asking.
If that's not the case, I'm happy to be correct. I thought both the Scottish government and the UK government supported the growth deals, working in partnership with local authorities. And the funding delivered through those growth deals is accounted and audited in the usual way.
One of the things she does comment on as well is the opacity of the negotiation of agreements. And I just wondered if much has been learned, given those criticisms, with regard to things like the spend allocated in the last UK budget to Scotland, specifically in relation to the money announced for the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and of course for the bridge in Mr Ross's constituency. And I wondered, could you talk us through the role, if any, the Scotland Office had in those particular decisions, or did the Scotland Office have no part in those decisions at all? Maybe Ms MacDonald, would that be?
Sure, I can try. I wasn't here.
Oh, all right.
But I'm more than happy to say that the money that goes through the Treasury, and the Edinburgh Festival, will go through DCMS. And as far as I'm aware, in my very long career here, the National Audit Office has oversight of all the money spent through departments, and the Parliamentary Accounts Committee then has oversight of all that money spent. So wherever the money lands, whether it's abroad as part of what we spend through FCDO, or whether it's in Scotland as part of DCMS's paying the Edinburgh Festival, it would be scrutinised through the National Audit Office and through the accountants. And of course the accounting officer, as I am myself, would be responsible for all that money. Mm-hmm. We absolutely have discussions with Treasury when it comes to fiscal events about where money should be spent, and we were very happy to support the Edinburgh Fringe and the Edinburgh Festival in asking for more money.
Okay. And can I just ask about the mechanics of how those... I mean, I think the director of the Festival Fringe indicated she'd spoken directly to someone in government in regard to that fund. Did she approach the Scotland Office or Treasury directly or DCMS?
Probably a number of people, if I'm going to be honest. If you know, these things come together through a grouping of people, so the cultural team in DCMS would have had an interest. Treasury obviously has an interest. The Scotland Office clearly has an interest as well, but also probably DLUC with intergovernmental relations. There's yes. usually a number of conversations about how receptive government could be, what money we do have, stuff like that, and it helps us to be able to say what we're looking for and joined up with how we can do these things.
Mr Lamont, Minister, did you have something to add to that?
No, I just was going to reiterate the point that Lynn MacDonald just made me. I certainly on a personal level engaged with Shona from the Edinburgh Festivals, and I know how positive they were and pleased about the funding that they received from the UK government, and I'm sure you'll welcome it as well.
Oh yes, but I'm just thinking of many other cultural organisations in Edinburgh in particular, but certainly throughout Scotland, who are surprised about the allocation of that, and certainly there have been questions raised about the bridge in Mr Ross's constituency.
Can you name the bridge?
No, I can't.
Well, maybe don't ask about something.
Well, perhaps you can name it.
Order.
Well, no, I've been asked the question. It's called the Horrocks Bridge, but Ms Brock has spent a large chunk of this time. No, if I can, Chair.
No, you can't.
So you're not allowing a member to speak.
We're going in a particular order.
Well,
Ms Brock is asking some questions just now.
Oh, thank God, because it's been going on for quite a while.
Philippa Pfeffer put her hand up for a supplementary. So, Philippa.
Yes, it's just really around the Ayrshire growth deal, which is in my constituency. I presented it to the former Prime Minister, the member for Maidenhead, in December 16, and it was agreed. But my understanding is that it is just taking an eternity to get business cases approved and money to actually arrive. And surely with inflation at 10%, the original vision of what that money was going to achieve 7 years ago is just evaporating in front of us. And if that's happening to other growth deals, is it not that you need to get a shift on to actually get the money to the project before actually they're just going to disappear into the sand?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that when we look at these growth deals, that some of the councils, the bigger councils, have got more resources perhaps to put into these, and we do see some of those moving faster. And at the end of the day, because of the need to account for public money, these business cases need to be sound and solid. And so that we do accept that in some of the non-city deals, there's been a slower progress in those local authorities. And we have got resource now available to help push that through. And there's absolutely no concept of us dragging our feet on this at all in North Ayrshire. In fact, all 3 areas of Ayrshire have been to quite a lot in the last 12 months. And there's a lot of appetite for the Levelling Up agenda. There's a lot of good projects. There was a terrific project, it was a great shame, which was the RDR project on fusion, nuclear fusion, but obviously because the Scottish Government doesn't have a policy on nuclear, we couldn't progress that. But there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of, but it's just there's a lot of enthusiasm and enterprise.
But they didn't win. North and South both put in Levelling Up projects. Well, it spent money doing business cases, which obviously didn't go through, which is a change from the former funding they used to get from the EU, where they got funding every year. Now they're all competing with each other, and it's about 8 per RAF to go through. But in the Ayrshire growth deal, it's South Ayrshire Council who were saying that their business cases were lying here for a long time in between. So it's not it's coming back quickly saying fix this, get more information here. It's that it's taking a long time for each step, from outline business case, next outline business case, to actually get to a point of money in the bank being spent on whatever it is, concrete, tarmac.
But you would assume that you would expect that we have a thorough process and these business cases need to be cleared. So, and there's no concept of anyone dragging their feet. I'm happy to look into specifics of the Ayrshire. I'll look into specifics of the Ayrshire.
We're now facing 10% inflation.
She's going to look at it and get back in touch with that. Kristen Chard, you want to come in here, yeah?
Yeah, very, very briefly. First of all, to declare an interest, I may have been one of those many parties who made representations to DCMS and to the UK government to support the Edinburgh Festival and some other cultural organisations. But just to clarify, presumably I wasn't the only one, and that a lot of local MPs do also speak to the UK government for funding for this.
Yes, even SNP ones. Rowley.
Thank you. David Duckett.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk about the retained EU law bill, if I can, briefly. Well, maybe not so briefly, but just there's been a lot of talk on what the bill does, what it doesn't do. A lot of speculation in the press, bonfires of regulations kind of stuff. And I was wondering, it looks like Minister Lamont's getting ready to respond to me. If you could maybe just give us an overview of the benefits of the rule bill, and in particular to the society and economy of Scotland.
Well, as you will be aware, Mr Duke, the government has set out its plans in terms of the repeal of those bits of legislation which are no longer applicable. The structure has been put in place to ensure that we've been engaging with the Scottish Government to deal with those bits of legislation which affect devolved spaces. And my colleague Nusrat Ghani, who's a bill minister, attended Interministerial Standing Committee on the 17th of May, which was an opportunity to discuss the amendments to the bill with the Scottish Government. And there's, I think, particularly around the sunset clause, which clearly the government has, the amendment on the sunset clause, which the government has tabled recently.
So you mentioned Nusrat Ghani there being the bill minister. How often would she, I know you're not here to talk for her department, but how often would UK government and Scottish government get together to discuss the progression of this bill?
Well, clearly the Interministerial Standing Committee has been the most recent opportunity. That was on the 17th of May, I think. There's also the Brexit Opportunities Unit, which has been having ongoing engagement with the Scottish government and the other devolved administrations at an official level around the EU retained law bill. And there's also the working group meeting, which has been meeting on a fortnightly basis since March 2022, I believe.
And how many of the, I think it's close to 600 retained EU laws that are currently planned to be revoked, how many of those cover policy areas that are devolved? Do you have that number to hand?
So, as you will know, the schedule to the bill, the repeal schedule, currently includes 587 pieces of legislation. Of those pieces of retained EU law, it's estimated around 39% are devolved in some areas or are of mixed competency, so they're split between the devolved and the UK Parliament. And the schedule also includes legislation that applies only to devolved areas. Now, this approach in the bill, I think, sets out the previous approach in relation to the sunset, which applied to both reserved and devolved areas, and it'll ensure a greater degree of certainty and consistency across the whole of the UK.
Okay, thanks. And just finally, I know it's been another concern that's been raised recently, especially in light of the amendment. Can you, as UK Government ministers, confirm that the bill will still fulfil the government's manifesto to end the supremacy of EU law across the UK?
Well, I think that commitment has already been delivered on, Mr. Duke.
Okay. I just want to get it on record because there's some concerns out there that it's somehow backtracking on it.
Yeah.
Okay,
the date is part of it.
I think 31st of December, from the 31st of December this year, that would be the case.
Okay.
I think that was announced, wasn't it, last week? That was the case, yeah. Okay, thank you. Phyllis Woodford.
Thanks very much. Just staying with the retained EU law, obviously on the 10th of May is quite a big change of direction. We were looking at nearly 4,000 laws and regulations that would have collapsed by the end of this year. Now it's about 600. But as you've just highlighted, almost 40% of those are either devolved or mixed. And obviously Scottish ministers in the devolved areas will get to decide whether to restate or preserve. So if EU laws are revoked at Westminster but regulations are protected in Scotland, how exactly does the UK government plan to deal with divergence? Will that be through the common frameworks? And what about in policy areas that don't have common frameworks?
This was anticipated when we left the European Union. That was why we developed the common frameworks structure, and the common frameworks, as you will know, have been developed to ensure there is this common approach for those powers being returned from the European Union, which intersect into policy areas which are devolved and are the competency of the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament. I think we should also note that both the UK Government and the Scottish Government and all the devolved governments have agreed that where the common frameworks are operating, they are the right mechanism for agreeing and formulating our position in terms of retained EU law reforms in the areas that they cover. My understanding is the Scottish Government agrees with that too. So if the EU retained law falls into a common framework area, then the UK Government expects to use the processes within that framework to discuss the plans for those laws with the devolved government, in this case the Scottish Government.
But is it likely that things like the Internal Market Act will then be used to block decisions made in Scotland to perhaps stick with a regulation that actually Westminster wants to get rid of? Because obviously, as I'm going to come on to in my next question, is the deposit return scheme. And although that's devolved and has been being discussed in the common frameworks, at the moment that's sitting in limbo. So are we going to just see lots and lots of that kind of thing happening in the coming years?
I think it's important to note and just understand that the frameworks work in parallel with the UK Internal Market Act. And as I said, the frameworks are there to ensure there is this approach where the policy areas fall into the framework, but clearly the UK Internal Market Act also exists to protect the integrity of the United Kingdom market in the same way as the EU protected the EU single market. The UK government's got a need and desire, rightly I believe, to protect the integrity of the UK market, to ensure there's not this divergence which impacts on trade and employment opportunities across Scotland if there was a significant divergence. So they work in parallel.
Well, obviously the single market specifically allows derogations for public health and environmental protection for different countries to do things in different ways. So why does the Internal Market Act not have derogations for public health and environment when those are responsibilities of the devolved government?
Well, as we've seen with the deposit return scheme, the Scottish Government has applied for a derogation under the UK Internal Market Act, which I suspect your next question is about to lead into.
Yes. The Environmental Audit Committee in 2021 actually called for the UK government to get on with a deposit return scheme, that it was urgent, and called for an all-in scheme, not just including glass, but including cartons. So why exactly, under the hints that we had in February from the Secretary of State, would it be that the UK government would want to block the Scottish, and we understand also Welsh government, from having a more inclusive deposit return scheme?
I
Well, I will answer that. What we've asked for, so let's be clear about something which, again, I seem to be able to clear this up in these sort of meetings. The first formal request to ministers was on the 6th of March. Now, that was cleared up this morning again in the DEFRA IMG meeting. I saw some raising of eyebrows over there when I made that remark, but to be absolutely clear, and I know one of the Green MSPs said to me that wrote to the Speaker of the House and the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case to say that wasn't the case. Well, I responded to both the Speaker and to the Cabinet Secretary, and I copied it to the presiding officer of the letter, and I copied it to the relevant MSP. And I laid out exactly what happened at the minutes and the meetings between officials, and where we got to when a formal request was made on the 6th of March. And that letter, funnily enough, which made it crystal clear as day that I was accurate, that I was correct in what I said, including the First Minister received a letter from the Prime Minister laying it out, and on we go. I mean, we've been very clear about it. It absolutely was first requested formally, and we started to look at it formally across Whitehall on the 6th of March. So that is not
but the process did start last October.
Sorry?
The process through the common frameworks, which your ministerial colleague said is part of the structure of the IMA, started in October.
Yeah, I know, but that...
And completed in February.
But actually what common framework says, the common framework says that we should... that these things should be dealt with across Whitehall before they actually go into the common framework process. That's in the instructions, the protocols of how common frameworks work. But in this occasion, the discussions were taking place with DEFRA, but not with the Department for Business and Trade, who own the UKIM legislation, not with the Welsh office or the Scottish office or DLUC, who have obviously will represent local authorities on these matters and the impact on them, and on it goes. Those discussions were taking place, but hadn't taken place at ministerial level, and effectively the Scottish Government went ahead and put in place Circularity Scotland with no impact assessments on since post-UKIM, sorry. The only impact assessments were pre-UKIM, and we needed to see the Department for Business and Trade impact assessments on consumers, on consumer choice, on costs to consumers, on businesses, on trade within the UK, and on international trade. And those impact assessments, as I said this morning in the meeting, still haven't been done, but it's important they are done, because before you go and build your house, you should seek planning permission. The Scottish Government have built a house, and now they're asking for planning permission. It's the wrong way around.
But Secretary of State, you just said that actually the Scottish Government should have been in touch with all the ministries across Whitehall before even going in.
That's what the frameworks protocol says, yeah.
So so the common frameworks is not where these things are discussed and refined before taking them to a minister. So you'd be writing to a minister with an empty page going, can we have permission to do this?
The Scottish Government should have come and talked to us about, after the UKIM legislation, they should have come and talked to us about an exemption. You minister to minister at that time, and that didn't happen.
But without being able to describe what the scheme would be.
Sorry?
But without being able to describe the scheme in detail.
Well,
they say they raised
it
in principle in 2021.
This is the point. They went ahead. They didn't have a scheme for us to discuss in detail, because it's been evolving ever since. The officials have been talking to officials, but we've seen Circularity Scotland have come along. They've changed the rules. Now we have less than 5,000 units, and you're not included. Since then, we've seen online retailers across the UK. Tesco, the largest retailer, say the scheme's not fit for purpose, but they've also said, along with other online retailers who deliver to your home, that they won't deliver anything recyclable in their model now, because they've been told they have to collect that. They have to collect the bottles from the elderly and the infirm who they deliver online to, and they've said that's not in their business model, and they can't do it. And I challenged the Minister on this morning, and she said to me, well, of course, that's a matter for the Scottish Government to sort out. And I said, well, if you think that, you don't understand how UKIM works. This is a matter for the largest retailer in the United Kingdom. It's a matter for the 85% of product that comes into Scotland is from around the world and the rest of the UK. That's what the exemption is being sought for. That absolutely directly impacts their sales. It directly impacts consumers. It directly impacts jobs. To think that it's not a UKIP matter is naive and extreme.
Well, it's not that
and
they
it's
didn't
still
think it was
evolving,
a
and I'm
UKIP
told
matter.
that's a
They
problem.
raised it within the common frameworks
Sorry,
in October.
Sorry?
You're suggesting they didn't engage at all. This has been under detailed discussion
what I'm saying
since
to you
last October.
What I'm saying
Maybe
to
the
you, and what I'm
process
saying to
isn't
you-
clear enough.
No, what I'm saying is minister to minister, whether it's the Secretary of State for Business and Trade who owns this. Let's be honest, they own UKIM. UKIM sat with Bayes, now it sits with DBT. The Secretary of State for Business and Trade, and I've discussed it with her on many occasions, was not engaged in this until the official request came through on the 6th of March.
And yet we're told it's DEFRA that will make a decision, not Business
No,
and
you're
Trade.
not told DEFRA will make the decision. The decision will be made across Whitehall. It'll be made by the Welsh office, the Scotland office, DLUC, the Cabinet office, Number 10. All the people are directly impacted.
With the similar schemes in multiple countries across Europe,
Yeah.
in Finland with 95 to 98% collection rates, big companies like Coca-Cola saying, why are you holding this back? Why are you holding it back? You may learn both from difficulties and achievements.
So what I'm saying to you is that the UK internal, but I think you're going off piece and because
it's the DRS I'm wanting to
Right, order. I think we've
clear,
exhausted this line of inquiry when it comes to
this. Just for
last word, Secretary of State.
So, but no, just to be clear, Finland is not a devolved administration. There are not examples of devolved administrations not running schemes that aren't run by the national government. They may have slightly different schemes, but the national government
has... But yet environment and waste is devolved.
You're just talking over me.
Okay, right, order.
But the point is, it's very difficult not to create trade barriers within the United Kingdom, and UKIM is there to protect that. And I've had over 1,000 businesses write to me. I've had people who supply wine from France saying they won't supply their wine into Scotland, the market's too small, they won't relabel. It's affecting consumer choice, it's affecting jobs. The impacts are massive, and I've got that in detail. Okay. I'm asking the Scottish Government those questions, I'm wanting answers, and then we can do a proper assessment. But at the moment, I haven't got answers to those questions, nor do we have answers to the fact that Tesco Online will not deliver bottles or cans to their customers, and some of those customers don't have the choice of going to supermarkets. So let's stop and think about them. I'm sorry, I'm being interrupted.
We've given this a
when I say
run.
things that they don't like hearing, I often
okay,
get interrupted.
order, please. We've got lots of questions, and I know lots of people have got lots of things they want to bring forward. David, did you want to come in at this point?
If we're moving on from intergovernmental relations, I just wanted to ask about one more topic. You didn't think I was going to let you go without talking about fishing, clearly. So, on the subject of highly protected marine areas, again, a bit like the deposit return scheme, it's something that both Scotland's governments are looking at. Both governments have different responsibilities at different levels. So, for example, with HPMAs, it's the difference between what's done inshore versus offshore. And I was just wondering if Secretary of State or Minister Lamont could say something about how the two governments, Scotland's two governments, have discussed not the principle of HPMAs, because I think people generally agree with conservation, sustainability, marine protection, but on the discussion between governments of how best to approach HPMAs. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister has said that he'd like the Scottish Government to do a U-turn on it only because there are pilot schemes being run by DEFRA, and we want to share those with the Scottish Government. And we know there's outrage amongst fishing communities, and we believe that fishing communities are best at preserving their stocks and having creating a sustainable future. But we won't be doing HPMAs in Scotland outside the 12-mile nautical limit, which is UK government responsibility. And it's up to the Scottish Government, of course, if they want to do them inside. But when asked for an opinion, our opinion, my opinion, the Prime Minister's opinion, as he said at PMQs, is that we would prefer if the Scottish Government waited until we see the results of the pilots before pushing ahead, because we think that's what fishing communities would like to see. But there haven't been detailed discussions. It's just a an opinion, but it is devolved. If they want to go ahead and create these HPMAs, that is entirely a matter for them, and we will not interfere, but we will still offer to share the results of our pilot schemes.
And Minister Lamont, maybe on the idea of spatial squeeze. I mean, the more and more use of our marine environment, not just for fishing, but also for offshore wind. Is this something that you've been discussing more directly with the industry in Scotland?
Yes, is the short answer, both in my ministerial role and also as a constituency member, which has a large coastal community, and it's come up certainly around the margins at the action group, the seafood action group that I chair, and I know the representative bodies have concerns about just how the marine space is being used, and ensure we get the balance right between all the different pressures, whilst at the same time maintaining a healthy and sustainable fishing industry.
And what discussions are you having between different government departments as well as devolved administrations to help make sure that those concerns are not just raised but heard and acted upon? Well, as the Secretary of State has said, we're very keen to share from a UK perspective the evidence that we've been gathering in respect of the highly protected marine areas with the Scottish Government to ensure that they are better informed in terms of whatever decisions that they make, and I'm sure the fishing industry would support such a move. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Kristen Chap.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to ask, the concerns of the fishing communities are very real and very important, but there's also the question of the subsea structures for not just the oil and gas industry, but crucially for renewable energies. Now, those subsea structures, as I understand it, are actually reserved. It's a reserved area. Has that been discussed with the Scottish Government, and has that been taken into account in discussions?
I certainly have. In terms of the connection, do you mean in terms of ensuring that the new offshore wind resources are connected to the grid? Certainly that has been discussed. I've also had a meeting recently with Minister Bowie in terms of just the connection rates and the capacity within the network. So it certainly has been discussed within government, and there's been other discussions that we've had with the Scottish Government, but also I think more widely with the sector and those businesses that are connected with this. They've certainly raised it with me.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Chair, and lovely to see you all today. So funding is what I'd like to move on to, and dare I say it, funding and how much it is and whether it was more or less than before is always one that comes up in political narrative. So my very basic question is, to what extent are the Scottish Government consulted in changes to allocation, particularly around in-year funding decreases? And I'd be really interested to understand what role the Scotland Office plays in those discussions or notifications.
Well, the answer to that question is that it's extraordinarily transparent, the discussion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. It's all published and all available. The money, obviously, being the most important thing. Treasury in constant communication with Scottish Government on money. Obviously, there's a 3-year rolling framework within the Barnett formula. And then there's year-on-year interventions. And we've seen, for example, as all then that there's the consequentials that come from Barnett as well. So I think in this area there is very strong dialogue, as you'd imagine, and that we have, the Scotland Office has its voice in that as well. What's interesting, of course, is that when we come to the Barnett consequentials, under the scheme, which is a very flexible scheme for Scotland, London is not prescriptive to the Scottish Government as to how to spend those consequentials, so it's not required that Scotland follow exactly the same spending formulations that have given a rise to them in the first place in England. But as on the record, the discussions on money are very transparent, and there's even there's UK government funding decisions and the impact on devolved administrations, and there's there's full transparency on that.
So your position would be that there was nothing that could be done to increase that transparency. Do you feel comfortable with where things are?
I think the transparency is extraordinary. I mean, the issue is around the Barnett formula is that we know that is trying to make the UK fairer. It's obviously population size is one element of the Barnett formula, but you've also got the whole deprivation argument, population density. I mean, isn't the whole point of the United Kingdom that we want all citizens in the United Kingdom with the same public services wherever they live? So if you live in Stornoway, if you live in Streatham, you get the same level of public services. And so that is actually the strength of the United Kingdom, And when you boil it down, we have 8% of the population in Scotland. We have 33% of geography. So therefore Scotland by definition is a more expensive place to run. UK Treasury completely understands that and funds that. And when it comes down to it, for every £100 spent for one person in England, UK government spends £125 in Scotland.
So I suppose what I would say is we have seen, dare I say, a degree of churn within the UK government over the last year, 18 months, particularly in terms of leadership. And what that has resulted in has policy decisions that have had the Barnett consequentials that you've described, but potentially ones that are more unexpected. Do you not think that there is an opportunity potentially therefore to ensure that the Scottish Government is better placed to make the right decisions about the consequences of increased funding in non-devolved
There is a rolling 3-year framework, and this money is, the way the UK works, is it cannot just be subject to change of ministers. It can't be run on a whim like that. The UK is run on a much more consistent basis than that, and it's run by the Treasury in consultation with the Scottish civil servants. So that the underlying financial deal for Scotland is not subject to the whims or revolving doors of ministers. There may be particular issues where there's in-year funding discrepancies, but even then, it's done within the overall formula. The only real big difference on the annual basis is really the city and growth deals that we've talked about, and they're funded on an annual basis in discussion again between UK and Scottish Government.
Okay, so my other question then in relation to the role of the Scotland office. I mean, let's take, and I'll declare I'm the new chair of the APPG for Scotch whisky, but I think it would be fair to say the Scotch whisky industry had an expectation of the spring budget that did not materialise in relation to spirits duties. I got the impression that there was a degree of sympathy within the Scotland office for that. Are you the right interlocutor in relation to the Treasury to ensure that Scotland's best interests in relation
yes,
to
absolutely.
Scotland?
I'll just say, before not offered answers, I'd just say we've succeeded 9 years out of 10.
But I suppose most recently not.
So we talked to the Scottish Whisky Industry. I mean, they're an awesome lobbying group, as you know, so they talk to a lot of people. And they're always very popular wherever they go because you get a little tincture along the way. So we talk to them a lot. And the reality is that they have had, as Secretary of State said, they've had 9 budgets in a row with a freeze. Last year, our exports of food and drink from Scotland went up by 22%. 10% ahead of, by the way, when we were in the EU. So Brexit is actually seems to be very good for Scottish food and drink exports, with 10% ahead of where we were before. And they've had a record year of profitability. And in the meantime, we spent 400 million on COVID and 100 million on cost of living crisis. And we are going to certain sections of our community and saying, can you please pay a little bit more? In the meantime, to mitigate this, we're working incredibly hard to make sure they get access to new markets. So we get them access to international markets. We're removing tariffs in America. We're working hard to try and get them something in India. We're opening the world up, which is where that 22% increase in growth comes from, which employs a lot of people in Scotland, provides higher wages, and is good for our society. So we are absolutely all over Scotch whisky. But on this particular occasion, on balance, it was the fair and right decision to do.
So moving on then, just talking a little bit about needs-based accounts, and just looking forward, we'll all have heard this morning the deal that has been agreed or discussed with the BMA in Scotland that they're going to take out in relation to junior doctors. When we're looking forward, given the inflationary pressures that we're still seeing and public sector pay demands, is there any account being taken of that in relation to future funding for Scotland?
Well, inflation applies to everybody. Inflation doesn't respect borders or geographies. So there is a funding settlement given to the Scottish Government. It's up to the Scottish Government to prioritise where they want to spend that money, and it's up to them to cut their cloth as the English have to do within the UK settlement. So it's laudable that the Scottish. In fact, this is devolutionary action, isn't this? The Scottish Government making decisions about where they want to prioritise their funding. But there's no mechanism to come around and say, can I please have 10% more? Because the inflation applies to the whole of the UK Treasury budget. So the question you're asking really should be asked to the Scottish Government, which is, as you balance your books, as you give more to one section of the community, what are you cutting on another section of the community? And that really is for Holyrood rather than for here.
For them to do. Okay, I just wanted to ask about another couple of things then. So, levelling up funding. Obviously, we've had 2 rounds now. I'm sure there'll be people in the room whose constituencies have been successful and those otherwise. What are the plans in relation to any future rounds, and what does that mean potentially for areas that indeed have and haven't been successful?
Well, there's another round coming, levelling up round 3.
And what are the expectations of that?
On its way. My expectations of it are that we'll get some very good bids, because there's now a lot of local authorities that have bids prepared that maybe weren't successful in earlier rounds, and I'm hopeful that we'll get a good number of those bids over the finishing line.
Do you feel that there was potentially that piece where Scottish local authorities were slightly on an unlevel playing field, given that they had to adapt to UK government rules that potentially were more predicated towards English local authorities than what local authorities in Scotland were used to through Scottish Government?
So if I may come in, I was lucky enough to be in Peterhead when we announced the last round of awards. And I think my reflection of that is that there is a change in approach that's required, because previously many of the councils were very used to applying for funding for the European Union. Now they're applying for funding from the UK, and I think there's a willingness among Scottish councils to understand what the new process is and to ensure that they are putting in applications that are as strong as possible to ensure that they are successful. I'm sure you'll know that your own area 5 council got £32 million in levelling up funding, which included levelling up funding from round 2 and also 13.4 million from the UK shared prosperity fund,
so in the Glenrothes constituency,
and 24.5 million to the University of St Andrews Eden campus.
Which is the city deal. It was an early success through the city deal.
But I think what that demonstrates is where councils do engage, they are being successful, and hopefully in round 3, those councils in those areas of Scotland which hadn't been successful in previous rounds will see greater success.
So it sounds like you're looking for those councils that weren't successful in the first instance as opposed to constituencies. Would that be? Is that what I'm picking up?
No, I'm making the point that I think councils now recognise there is a new process. It wasn't what was there before with the EU funding, and I know that our colleagues at DLUC are very keen. I know they have given feedback to those councils which weren't successful. I'm sure your councils had that feedback as well, to ensure that when they go into round 3, they're putting in the very best applications they possibly can. But I mean, I think we need to accept there is a new process, UK government funding compared to what was there before with the EU.
And my final question is just around broadband, which is particularly an issue for constituencies that are more rural, like mine. Now, last year when the former Finance Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes appeared before this committee, I did raise my concern about the very low take-up of R100 vouchers, the Scottish Government scheme. I see that Project Gigabit is obviously looking at what it was going to be doing in Scotland. Are we going to have an update of what that might look like, and indeed how that will work alongside the Scottish Government's own project?
Well, first of all, can I just agree with you, Wendy, that having access to good broadband is absolutely essential in this day and age. I mean, I view it as having access to mains water and mains electric. Everybody should have access to good quality broadband. There have been issues with the Scottish Government's R100 scheme. The UK Government's now has got its project Gigabit underway. I mean, if there's any particular examples or points you want to have checked with me, if you want to give me the details separately, I'll send them.
I'll write you separately.
That's
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Liz Ross.
Thank you. Good afternoon, CCC. McDonald. I've got a number of issues I want to ask about, but I just want to pick up on some of the evidence we've heard so far. The Chair opened his question to you, Secretary of State, speaking about language that is inflammatory. Earlier this morning we heard the Deputy Leader of the SNP on Radio Scotland referring to the UK as acting like a rogue state. The former First Minister accused people who disagreed with her Gender Recognition Reform Act as she said they're transphobic, they're deeply misogynistic, often homophobic, and some of them are racist as well. Do you think that's potentially some of the language that Chair was referring to about inflammatory language coming from governments?
So it is inflammatory language, and I mean, as I said at the beginning, I'm always open up with, and if I was talking to the First Minister or the new First Minister, as I have done, I will always up front get what divides us out of the way quickly in a light-hearted but firm way, and then we try and get onto the things that we can sort out between us. And I think that sort of language is very inflammatory.
And we also heard from Ms Brock who was asking what I think you described, Secretary of State, as trying to agitate for grievance where there was none on the growth deals, on levelling up and other funding from the UK government and the Scottish government. It was clearly ill-informed because Ms Brock couldn't even name Clodagh Bridge, which received £1.5 million in Murray. But if we look at the line of questioning Ms Brock was taking, the one area and group of people she missed out were the people who benefit from that funding, whether the funding comes from the Scottish government or the UK government separately, or in the case of growth deals jointly between the two governments. Surely the most important point is that is investment in Scotland, and was that not missing from Ms Brock's questions?
That's why I was slightly questioning whether or not we were looking for a grievance where none existed. City and region growth deals have been incredibly successful. The Scottish Government have never complained to us about their operation, neither in terms of the structure, which was put in place before my time, but that is the structure. We haven't had any pushback on the structure, and we certainly haven't had anyone say, don't give us that money.
Minister Offord, Minister Lamont, anything you would like to add on the working relationships with the communities in particular, rather than the two governments on growth deals or levelling up? Minister Offord.
I think it's been really energising. We have a lot of conversations now with the local authorities of all political parties, and what's really interesting is the politics disappears. There's one common theme amongst all local authorities: they all want to make their communities better. And they come up with the projects that they think will help to do that. And all we are is, in government is a catalyst to allow local people to make their own decisions to improve their own communities. And it's unleashed a whole amount of energy in local authorities, and it's been a joy to be part of.
Yeah, I agree. And the Prime Minister's been very clear that he wants both governments, both the UK government and the Scottish government, to work well together. I think the growth deals are an example of that happening in practice for the betterment of all the communities all of us elected round this table represent. And certainly in my own constituency's perspective, from their perspective, they've been very, very welcoming of both UK and Scottish government funding being delivered through the growth deal.
Thank you. Could I return to the topic of the deposit return scheme? Last week, the Minister in charge in Scotland, Lorna Slater, suggested if an exemption from the UK internal market is not granted by the end of this month, indeed just over a week away, then the whole scheme is in jeopardy. First of all, Secretary of State, is that a timescale you recognise? Has that been passed on to you? And do you believe an exemption will or will not be issued in that period?
Well, it's a timescale that I've read about. It's a timescale that that was mentioned in the IMG this morning. That Circularity Scotland would. It was alluded to the fact it would fail if there was no exemption by the end of this month. I mean, I would say that that's entirely a matter for the Scottish Government. They have set up Circularity Scotland. What I'm concerned about is the money that may be lost by companies in the event of...
Come on to the money in a moment, but while it is clearly a Scottish Government proposal and they set the timeframes, etc., ultimately it will be up to you, and I think you said to Dr Whitford, across departments deciding on that exemption. Do you envisage it being a decision taken before the end of this month? I think when you appeared before us last time, you made an analogy with a previous request for an exemption and the time period. What was the time period with that?
So that was just over 3 months. So that request, which came formally in writing, minister to minister, to Lorna Slater to George Eustace, and actually I alluded to this letter again this morning when we were meeting. That came in December. It was replied to in January of the years. I can't remember the specific years, so I won't quote them. And then we said that it would take circa 3 months. As it was that the whole thing had washed through by March. Now, by May, actually, well, between March and May. So there was one step in March and then another step in May. But what was given there was an exemption on plastic cutlery on the basis that the scheme was 6 months behind the UK government scheme. It was identical, and it was a time-limited exemption until the two schemes caught up with each other. So it was quite a relatively straightforward one to give, whereas there's much more divergence on these two schemes. This time it's much harder. We had no businesses writing to us saying this is terrible. Everyone accepted. My position is we should be building recycling as fast as we can. Some areas are more successful than others, but I'm very pro-recycling. But what I'm not pro is costing huge inflation to the consumer or removing choice to the consumer, or damaging businesses, costing jobs, or damaging our trade within the UK, because 60% of Scotland's trade is with the rest of the UK. And I still give this example that when we, you know, I'm told by one of the product manufacturers that they will have to add 10 pence to a plastic bottle to charge the consumer. Coca-Cola have told me it's 5 pence for a plastic bottle, 2 pence for a can, but their figures are lower because they've got volume on their side, and that's inflationary. You know, 12 bottles of water from Aldi is £1.69. Under this scheme, it would have gone, and I've said this in the dispatch box, and I've said it in ministerial meetings, and no one's contradicted me. That would have gone to £5.29 in August from £1.69 in the shopping basket. £2.40 of that you could recover, 20p a bottle, but the other £1.20 is not recoverable. That is hugely inflationary when we have cost of living challenges, and I want to see the impact of that done in proper grown-up assessments, and the impact that it has is important when we come to just make our decision and on that and on trade and the damage it does to trade.
But I think the point I'm trying to get at, I mean, we're 9 days away from this deadline, which became public on Thursday.
I'm avoiding your point.
No, but I'm asking, is it even possible for the UK government to make that determination in the next 9 days? Because since the informal request went in, and the date that the Greens and the Scottish Government used, or the formal letter and the actual trigger for this mechanism to be established, the scheme has changed considerably.
Correct.
So how can the UK government...
Correct.
You know,
and there's still
the
problems to be
happens
ironed out around online, as I said earlier, online retailers not supplying recyclable products to homes. Tesco Online and all the others have said they can't do it. And there are a number of other issues. But what I would say is this. At the IMG, the Interministerial Government meeting on the 17th of April, I asked for impact assessments to be done on consumer choice, consumer costs, to businesses, to trade within the UK, and to international trade. In other words, what effect it has on trade deals. You know, will France and Australia and others, New Zealand, not change their labelling runs to not supply Wales or Scotland if they include glass because the market isn't big enough and they can sell it elsewhere, and all these things. And I haven't seen those proper impact assessments yet, and I can't come to a decision on an exemption until I see proper impact assessments so that we know we're making the right decision and we're not causing unnecessary consequences.
And looking at these consequences for businesses, they are significant. Indeed, there's reports that potential compensation claims could run to hundreds of millions of pounds. At the weekend, Hamza Yousaf suggested that it would be the UK government that would be paying that compensation. My colleague Maurice Golden, who's led on this issue in the Scottish Parliament, said it would be utterly delusional for Hamza Yousaf to think that the UK government should be liable for that. Do you agree?
Well, it's absolutely got nothing to do with the UK government. I mean, we were formally asked to consider this on the 6th of March. I have asked for impact assessments that are post-UKIM, not pre-UKIM, which is absolutely the right thing to do. I haven't seen those yet. Department of Business and Trade, I've suggested, but it hasn't been agreed with the Scottish Government that they would do those, but that I would suggest that they should be doing them, and I have suggested that in meetings, because I think then everyone can feed in. I can feed in on behalf of all the stakeholders who have come to me and businesses with their concerns. DEFRA can feed in on their views, the Scottish Government can feed in theirs, the Welsh Government can feed in theirs, and the Treasury can feed in their views, and then we have a process that takes us to a proper assessment of the impacts to internal UK trade, which is what mutual recognition and non-discrimination of what we're trying to protect across the United Kingdom, and that's a serious factor here. And I have yet to see the workings that could let me take a responsible decision on this, one way or the other, with any confidence.
Is there any correspondence that you could find or share with the committee of the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, putting in writing a request that the UK government pays the compensation for the failure of his scheme and the SNP Green scheme in Scotland? Has he even approached the UK government about this before announcing it to the media on Saturday?
No, that letter has not been received.
Okay, thank you. Finally, can I move to you, Ms MacDonald? JP Marks, the head civil servant in the Scottish Government, has dismissed some of the criticism of Hamza Yousaf appointing a Minister for Independence. As the head civil servant acting at the moment in the Scotland office, what is your view on the First Minister appointing a Minister for Independence?
I wouldn't want to comment on the First Minister because that's entirely up to them to appoint who they want as a minister. In terms of the civil service, we work under a code that allows us to work on non-political matters, and every civil servant is aware of that code and aware of how to go about it if they have any problems with it. And as a lead civil servant, as the person who looks after my own office, I make it very clear with my staff if and when they feel uncomfortable or that the work they're being asked to do is not within that code, that they absolutely have a right to come to me and speak about it or to put in. I'm very pleased to say that's never happened. To my knowledge, that ministers are more than aware, thank you, of when it's political and when it's within our remit. And it has worked, worked well. I've been here for 36 years and I've never had occasions to raise it as an issue.
Secretary of State, I know you wrote to, I think it was the Scottish Government, or sorry, maybe the Permanent Secretary here in the UK Government about the appointment of this minister. At the same time that Hamza Yusuf appointed a Minister for Independence, he removed the Ministers for Social Security and Tourism from the Scottish Government portfolio of ministers. What's your view? I understand, and I asked Ms MacDonald to bring her into these discussions, and it's good that we have her here today, but she naturally has to take a neutral view on this. What's your view as Secretary of State for Scotland?
Well, my view is that I think that taxpayers' money could be better used elsewhere. You know, we've got record drug deaths in Scotland. We have falling attainment standards in education, NHS waiting list and issues, ferry failures, left, right, and centre, and on. I mean, I just could go on and on, but I won't. But the point is, I just think that money could be more wisely spent on delivery for the people of Scotland and the public services that are devolved. And I have made it clear that I don't think a minister for independence any more than there should be a minister for removing Trident from Faslane, which is also in the SNP manifesto. You know, I don't think civil servants. My view is it's a UK civil service. I don't think civil servants should be working on policy documents to remove Trident from Faslane any more than they should be working on policy documents to break up the United Kingdom. We know from the Supreme Court judgment in November last year that this is entirely reserved to the UK government. That area is entirely reserved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There was no indication of a time limit for your appearance here today. I'm hoping that we've still got time for questions.
Sorry, just on this point, can I just check, Chair, that there was a discussion in the pre-meeting that the Secretary of State would be here till 4:30 today. You
I
allowed
have a cabinet
46
subcommittee at
minutes for
4:45.
That wasn't communicated to our clerks, so unfortunately I think we've heard since, and Mr Ross did say that, but there was nothing communicated from
Well, I will be leaving at 4:30 because I have a cabinet subcommittee on a very important matter at 4:45.
It would have been really helpful had you let our clerks know that was going to be the
I
case.
apologise, Chairman, if my office didn't tell you that, but I was told that that you'd been told there was a hard stop at 4:30, your clerks.
We didn't get that.
Well, we'll confirm.
Thank you. We'll try and get everybody.
If there was a communication, we'll send it to you because that's what I was told.
So we've got questions from Sally Ann Hart and Christine Jardaville. So first of all, Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to focus a bit on the Section 35 order. And so given that too many SNP members, or that appears too many SNP members of the Scottish Government believe that there is no evidence that predatory and abusive men could exploit the SNP's self-ID gender reforms, despite evidence to the contrary, the most recent incident being the trans woman Butcher who sexually assaulted a primary school girl over a 27-hour period, amongst other concerning incidents. Do you think that it's possible that the Scottish Government would even consider making changes, reforming their gender recognition reform bill, so that its measures will seek a balance, so that they will not impact on the rights of women and girls, let alone have an adverse effect on the Equalities Act? And what work have you done, if any, yet, with the Scottish Government and the Minister for Women and Equalities to identify such changes?
Right. Well, so the case of Andrew Miller, the Melrose butcher, is he has pled guilty, so it's no longer subject to it's no longer an ongoing legal inquiry or police inquiry, But I'm going to step back from all of that, despite that being the case. But I'm being straight with you I know that is the case. I'm going to step back from that in the position I'm in, and just say it's not for the role of the UK government to amend the bill or get into discussions with the Scottish Government on their bill. It is for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to reconsider the bill if that's what they choose to do. What they have chosen to do, the Scottish Government, is to challenge the bill in the Court of Session, and that is something we will robustly defend. I have my legal advice on that. I can't share that with you, but I can assure you that I did not take this decision lightly when I took it, and I took it because there are adverse effects on GB-wide legislation, and it's as a defence of devolution that I take that decision. I've noted the First Minister saying it's an attack on devolution. It's not an attack on devolution. The Scotland Act 1998 has Section 35 in it, and it has it there for a very good reason, which is when, as indeed Section 33, which is when legislation cuts into reserved areas. Section 35 is when legislation has adverse effects on UK-wide legislation. And that is why I took the decision, because I believe there are adverse effects on the GB-wide Equality Act 2010. And rather than have legislation by a devolved administration clashing with GB-wide legislation, I thought it was right to use Section 35, and that's all very clear in my statement of reasons. But I won't, it's up to the Scottish Government what changes they want to make, if they want to make any. I don't think that's their plan. I think their plan is, as I say, is very clearly that they want to go to court, and so be it.
And just picking up on sort of opposition to the statutory instrument here, do you know of any SNP member who tabled a prayer motion to oppose or use an opposition day to debate the statutory instrument laid on the 17th of January, which is the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, Prohibition on Submission for Royal Assent Order 2023? Has this been taken up here?
Right. Has that...
That was laid.
Dr. Whitford
was laid. A prayer was laid against the Section 35 statute.
Yes, against Section 35. So I think probably led by Stephen Flynn, it was prayed against. The decision I took was prayed against. But that wasn't debated because it's only when statutory instruments are prayed against by the Leader of the Opposition, that's the convention in Parliament, is there then a debate, consequently a debate.
Sorry, I'm just really conscious just to give Christine Jarvin an opportunity.
Just one more clarification. So you're waiting for the Scottish Government or the
no, but now, so the timetable, just to be clear, the timetable, the Scottish Government has chosen to pursue a judicial review, so the timetable is now a matter for the court.
Right, okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Christine Charter.
Thank you very much. Very briefly now, and I'll take if the Secretary of State doesn't mind, right back to the very beginning, where he said that he wanted to talk about Freeports.
Yes.
And the progress that they're making in the city and region growth deals. My own constituency, Edinburgh Airport, is included in one of those Freeports, the other one being in Cromarty, one in Firth of Forth, one in Cromarty. One of the main aims is job creation. So how would the government ensure that these jobs will be new jobs which are created and not just relocated, particularly in Cromarty, where there's a feeling that they needs perhaps to be community-led and in consultation with the community?
Well, I think that's a very fair question. Those that have been successful in bidding for free ports have already gone through an extensive bidding process, and they have to explain why for instance, their choice of tax site locations will minimise displacement, how they're going to create new jobs. So there is a barrier to get over there. I was at Cromarty Firth on Thursday. There's a very good announcement from a Japanese company bringing 150 direct jobs, 350 ancillary jobs, and then there's the sort of wider support jobs that happen above that, and that's a £200 million investment. But we've also seen there on the Ardis Airport, I think they're called Quantum Energy, I'm pretty sure it's Quantum Energy, and that's a £300 million investment's been announced, and again, that's creating new jobs, as indeed is the high-tech work that will be done. I think they're called Sumitomo, the Japanese company.
And are you confident that these will be highly skilled jobs? And
Yeah.
you'll be able to ensure that
Yes.
that's the case?
Absolutely. These are ticking the boxes. I mean, the Sumitomo jobs are certainly highly skilled and high wage jobs. And there are training academies being built in around that as well.
The other priority set out is decarbonisation. Now, particularly in the Firth of Forth, where we have Aeneas on one side of the Firth and Edinburgh Airport on the other, decarbonisation is going to be a high priority. So what measures are you going to be putting in place to ensure that the climate commitments of green free ports are met and that decarbonisation targets are achieved?
So that will be assessed by the UK Gov and Scotland Gov together, and there are criterion within their bids that they had to achieve, but now going forwards on the delivery of the projects, they have to meet targets, and that's entirely, it's being very carefully monitored, and it's a UK Gov, Scot Gov joint venture doing that.
One of the criticisms has been perhaps that this is greenwashing.
Yeah.
So how would you answer that criticism?
Yeah.
And what will you do to ensure that that doesn't actually turn out to be the case?
I mean, I just don't think it is greenwashing. What's happening, for instance, in the Cromarty Firth is, and I'll come to Forth in a minute, but in Cromarty Firth, what you're seeing is a huge investment in offshore wind delivery, and where the Cromarty Firth was leading in refurbing and updating oil rigs and doing all that work. I think they said they'd had over 700 rigs in over the years. They're now going to be making the floating wind farm platforms and the actual sticks themselves, the turbines, everything. So all of that's happening, and yet they're having to do it in a sort of decarbonised, move towards net zero kind of a way. And equally, we're going to see great things with the brownfield site at Grangemouth, which again, as you know, has been a refinery and petrochemical industry. So I'm absolutely sure that these port authorities who I've met and had detailed discussions with are focused very much on the ambitions for net zero and for delivering long-term sustainable jobs towards net zero.
One thing I'm particularly interested in finally is the potential marry-up between Aeneas on one side at Grangemouth and Edinburgh Airport on the other, and the potential for using that to drive the introduction of sustainable air fuels in Scotland and then the United Kingdom. Is that something the government is looking at and investing in?
Yeah, that is. I mean, there is ongoing work into that, and that absolutely is the sort of thing that fits the bill. There's no question about it. There's also linking. There's links happening on potential investment already between Forth and Cromarty, and then there's work going on. As you know, we want to fast track the next. Hopefully, ACORN will be successful in the next carbon capture, utilisation, and storage. We want to fast track that, and we know that the pipeline from Grangemouth up to the northeast, to the northeast, particularly, I think Peterhead will be where the heavy lifting is done on this. We know that pipeline will be utilised for moving industrial carbon back up.
It's almost as if it were planned.
It's all beginning to make sense.
Thank you.
Yes, I know, yeah. But just before you go, we're very grateful for the whole team turning up once again. I think you're coming soon to the committee again, Secretary of State, which we're very much looking forward to. But I think there's a couple of things that you said you'd write to the committee about, and I'm sure that notes have been taken off what was required.
I'll check the minutes.
See what you could do.
Not everything I agreed to write on, but I'll check the minutes.
We'll expect that in due course, but thank you ever so much for your attendance this afternoon. Order.